Welcome to Karma Chronicles. Please like the video and subscribe. Let's begin. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was the day of my grandmother Evelyn's funeral. The house was packed with family, the kind of scene where people who hadn't seen each other in years suddenly became experts on every little thing. Her jewelry, her antiques, her porcelain collections. They'd grab whatever they could get their hands on, and I could practically hear the clink of cash in their eyes. My brother, Ethan, was the worst of them. He kept muttering about how he was going to take the grandfather clock in the corner. My mom, Lydia, was huddled in the kitchen, sighing loudly as she flipped through the stack of Evelyn's old bills. It felt less like a funeral and more like a yard sale. I didn't want to be part of it. So, while the arguing got louder inside, I slipped out the back door hoping for a little bit of silence. It was quiet in the garden, as it always had been. Evelyn used to sit out here watching the flowers bloom, sipping her tea, never bothered by the noise inside. I sat down on the old wooden bench under the oak tree, the place where she'd always sit. My fingers brushed over the back of the bench, and I closed my eyes for a moment. The smell of jasmine filled the air, and I tried to push away the image of her cold body lying in the house. It was too much. I pulled my phone from my pocket, just to distract myself. And there it was, a message from the lawyer's office. I thought it was just more formalities to sign off on, but when I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just an email, it was a letter from Evelyn. I clicked on the file, holding my breath. I wasn't expecting much. A final message, maybe a note about her old garden or the old rocking chair I used to love. But instead, the words sent a shiver down my spine. Clara, if you are reading this, then I'm gone. I've left you something I've kept secret for many years. You are the sole heir to my agricultural empire, a fortune worth more than $30 million. I have spent my life building it, an empire in farmland, crops, and patents, spanning multiple states. I've lived modestly, as you know. Your mother and brother will never understand the extent of what I've done. But you, Clara, have always had the strength to carry this on. Don't tell them. Let them think you have nothing. Only then will you see who they really are. I stared at the screen. $30 million? My grandmother, who I'd always thought was just barely scraping by, had secretly built an empire? My mind was reeling, struggling to take in the words. This couldn't be real. I'd always assumed she lived as a widow, frugal and humble, keeping to herself. But this was something else entirely. I didn't know what to think. My stomach twisted. What was this empire? Farmland? Patents? It didn't make sense. Why hadn't she told me? Why keep this from everyone? I quickly tapped out a response to the lawyer, asking for clarification, but deep down, I already knew this would change everything. If I was really the sole heir, this wasn't just about money. It was power, a secret Evelyn had guarded with her life. And now it was mine. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and sat there in silence. The house was still loud, but I couldn't focus on any of it. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like everything I knew had just been turned upside down, but I didn't know if I was ready for the storm that would follow. This was bigger than I'd ever imagined. I was no longer just Clara, the quiet florist. I was now the owner of something vast, something my family would never expect. And I was going to keep it that way, for now. I took a deep breath and stood up, walking back into the house. The arguing had only gotten worse, but I didn't care. I had my own plans now, and I wasn't about to let anyone in on them, not yet. A few days had passed since I found out about Evelyn's legacy, and life continued in its usual chaos. My family was still wrapped up in their petty squabbles, oblivious to the fact that their entire world was about to change. As for me, I kept my secret buried deep, like a treasure I didn't quite know how to handle. I returned to my normal life. Bloom and Petal, the local flower shop I managed. It was a quiet haven from the madness at home, a place where the fragrance of roses and lilies could calm my nerves. It was the one constant, and I'd poured everything into it. The smell of fresh flowers filled the air as I arranged the day's new shipments, bright sunflowers, pale pink peonies, and a dozen white orchids that caught the light just right. I loved how the flowers seemed to speak to me, their petals soft and delicate. They didn't care about the world outside, and for a moment, neither did I. But that afternoon, as I arranged a bouquet of irises, my phone buzzed. It was the lawyer again. The message was simple. The Evelyn Legacy Group is now active. Your first meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please confirm. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I placed the flowers in a vase. So much for keeping a low profile. The empire Evelyn built was no longer some distant fantasy. It was real, tangible, and waiting for me to step into. But I couldn't just step away from my life, not yet. I wasn't ready to leave the flower shop behind. It was all I knew, all I'd ever known. And yet, as the flowers wilted in my hands, I felt something shift inside me. A pull toward something bigger than this, something more important. I tapped out a quick reply, confirming. I'll be there. Later that evening, I sat with my mother and brother at dinner. The clink of silverware on plates filled the empty spaces between us. Ethan was on his phone, scrolling through some new app he'd found while my mother sighed dramatically about her latest credit card bill. You know, Clara, my mom started, cutting into her chicken breast with too much force. You really need to save more. I can't believe how much your brother spends on these silly little apps and drones. It's like he doesn't care about anything real. I kept my eyes on my plate, not daring to look up. Ethan's latest project, a failed farm tech app that never got off the ground, was the latest in a long line of his brilliant ideas. But I said nothing. Are you going to help him out with this latest drone thing? She asked, turning toward me with a look that said she already knew the answer. I hated how she always assumed I had the answers to everything. I'm not sure, I replied quietly. It's expensive. She waved her fork dismissively. Oh, come on. You've got the money now, don't you? You should help him. He's working so hard on it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that I had more money than they could ever imagine, that I could be the one to bail Ethan out of his failed projects. But I bit my tongue, the words lodging themselves deep in my throat. Evelyn's voice echoed in my mind. Let them think you have nothing. So I stayed silent. Ethan finally looked up from his phone, noticing the tension in the air. What's going on? He asked lazily, as if we weren't in the middle of a family discussion about his latest failure. You guys look like you're plotting something behind my back. I forced a smile. Just talking, I said, hoping to diffuse the situation. Nothing to worry about. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he was always looking for a way to make things work to his benefit. Always. He didn't care that I had worked hard to pay for college, to help him get started with his ideas, even when they went nowhere. I never expected a thank you. But I also never expected him to treat me like I was some kind of charity. My mother gave me a look of approval, then turned back to Ethan. Clara's always so responsible, she said. She'll get us out of this mess, won't you, dear? And there it was. I was the responsible one. The one who was always there. The one who did everything. It made me sick to think about how they saw me, how they had always seen me as their backup, their safety net. I stood up abruptly, leaving my uneaten food behind. I need to go, I have work to do, I muttered, not waiting for a reply. I needed space, time to think. I walked into the shop late that night, locking the door behind me. The lights flickered softly, casting shadows across the rows of flowers. My hands reached for my phone, the invitation to the first meeting with Evelyn's empire still sitting in my inbox. I was scared, more than I cared to admit. The life I had known was slipping through my fingers. I had spent my whole life thinking I was just Clara, the quiet florist who worked too much, who helped her family but never asked for anything. But now I had the power. I wasn't sure what to do with it. But I had to figure it out. Soon. The next few weeks felt like they were dragging by. I had my feet in two worlds, one foot in the flower shop, where I was still just Clara, the modest manager, and the other in this secret life, where Evelyn's vast empire waited for me to take control. The conflict inside me was suffocating. I couldn't let my family know, not yet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living a double life. And then there was Ethan. I couldn't escape the fact that my mother was always praising him, always assuming that he would succeed at something, anything. It was maddening. That evening, I found myself at one of those small family gatherings my mother loved to host, filled with fake smiles, uncomfortable conversations, and loud discussions about nothing that really mattered. Ethan was there, of course, talking about his brilliant new farm tech startup. His latest idea was some kind of drone that could monitor crop growth, something he'd been pitching to investors for months. He had this ridiculous belief that he was on the verge of success, even though his last 3 projects had all failed. I was sitting on the couch listening to him explain this new venture with the same fire that had burned in his eyes every other time he'd launched something that went nowhere. My mother sat across from me, nodding enthusiastically, hanging on every word Ethan said. I've got some great new ideas for the drone, Ethan said, leaning forward in his chair, eyes wide. I've been talking to this new group of investors, and they're really excited about it. I think this is the one. Mom smiled proudly. That's my boy, she said, as if he was the next Elon Musk. You'll make it. I just know it. I tried to suppress the eye roll that threatened to escape. This wasn't the first time Ethan had promised a big breakthrough, and I was tired of pretending like it mattered. To me, it was all a waste of time. And I was the one who had been footing the bill for these failed ventures. I'd paid for his app development, his prototype, and even the drone's first test flights, all while he made grand plans that never came through. I'm sure this time will be different, Ethan, I said, my voice flat. I couldn't help myself. I was done pretending. Ethan shot me a look, his smile faltering. What do you mean? Of course it will work. This is the one. I sighed, trying to keep the sarcasm in check. You've said that about every project, and yet, here we are. The tension in the room thickened. Mom's face shifted, but she quickly recovered. Don't be so hard on him, Clara, she chided. He's just trying to build something for himself. You could be a little more supportive. I stayed silent. My support for Ethan had been a bottomless pit, endlessly draining and never appreciated. I couldn't remember the last time he'd acknowledged anything I'd done for him. Not once. A moment later, the doorbell rang, and my cousin Laura stepped inside with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was the only one who didn't blindly cheer for Ethan's brilliance, and I could always count on her to see things the way I did. She greeted me with a hug, then glanced over at Ethan, shaking her head as if she had just heard the same tired pitch for the 100th time. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on anything but the escalating conversation. But of course, my mom didn't make it any easier. Clara, you never even think about saving money for Ethan's projects, she said, a little too loud. You've always been the one to play it safe. You should be encouraging him. I couldn't stop myself this time. Encouraging him? I repeated, almost laughing. Why? So he can waste more money on another failed startup? I've been supporting him for years, and I'm still waiting for him to actually finish something. Ethan shot up from his chair, his face turning red. You don't understand, he started, his voice rising. I'm trying to make something of myself, and you're just jealous because you've always been the one who played it safe. I felt the sting of his words, but I didn't back down. Jealous? Of what? You mean jealous of watching you fail over and over again while I foot the bill? There was an uncomfortable silence. Laura shifted in her seat, glancing between me and Ethan like she wasn't sure whether to intervene. Mom just stared at me, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and disapproval. You don't get it, Clara, Ethan said, his voice softer now, though still filled with that arrogance that made my blood boil. You don't get what it's like to take risks. You're stuck in that little flower shop, never trying anything new. Maybe you're too scared to fail. I stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with too much force. You have no idea what I've done, I said through gritted teeth. You think you're the only one with dreams? The only one who matters? Maybe I'm not chasing some startup dream, but I'm making something real, something that people actually need. My business may not be glamorous, but it's mine. I built it, and I'm proud of it. Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked out the front door without another word. Outside, I stood on the porch, the cool night air biting at my skin. I needed space, needed to breathe. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be the quiet, helpful one. But lately, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The truth Evelyn had left me, her empire, was starting to feel like a weight on my shoulders. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending it didn't matter. But tonight, as I stood alone in the dark, I knew I couldn't hide it much longer. The cracks in the facade were starting to show, and my family wasn't going to like what I was becoming. But I couldn't keep pretending I was just Clara. Not anymore. A few weeks passed, and life settled into an uncomfortable routine. I went to the flower shop every morning, the soothing ritual of arranging flowers doing little to quiet the storm in my mind. I was trying, desperately, to balance this facade of normalcy with the world Evelyn had left me, a world I wasn't ready to step into fully. But every time I walked into my mother's house, the tension pulled tighter. Lydia and my father, Robert, were stuck in a cycle of pretending everything was fine, but the cracks were beginning to show. The facade of their perfect, well-kept home was deteriorating. There were fewer luxury items around, the decorations had taken on a cheaper look, and even Lydia's once proud pearl necklace had been swapped out for costume jewelry. Every time I stepped inside, I saw it more clearly. One day, I drove over to my parents' house for dinner, expecting the same half-hearted pleasantries. But something felt different tonight, heavier. When I walked inside, I immediately noticed the atmosphere had shifted. It was off. Robert was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through some bills with a furrowed brow. Lydia was standing in the doorway, looking at a pile of overdue notices. "Clara," my mom greeted me, a little too brightly, "dinner's almost ready. Just give us a few more minutes." I nodded and stood in the kitchen, feeling like an outsider in my own home. The faint scent of burnt toast lingered in the air. There were no candles, no music, just the quiet sound of stress hanging thick in the air. "So," I said, trying to make conversation as I watched them shuffle papers around, "how's everything going?" My father sighed heavily and glanced up at me. "You know, it's fine, it's just, well, we've had some setbacks." "What kind of setbacks?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but I wanted to hear it. I wanted them to say it out loud. Lydia exchanged a look with Robert before responding, her voice quieter than usual. "We, well, we've had to take out another mortgage on the house." My stomach twisted. I couldn't believe it. Another mortgage? Wasn't this the house that had been their dream home? The place that had always symbolized success? I kept my face neutral. "Another one?" Lydia nodded, biting her lip. "It's just, things have been tight, you know, with Ethan's latest project not taking off, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I had to ask. "What about Ethan's drone project, the one you're so sure about?" Lydia's face reddened, but she quickly recovered. "Well, it's just not bringing in the money we thought it would. The investors, they've pulled back." I swallowed the growing frustration in my chest. They had been depending on Ethan's failure to succeed. They had been relying on him as they always did to bail them out. "And what about the money you've been asking me for?" I asked quietly, unable to keep the bitterness from seeping into my voice. "The bills? The repairs?" Robert looked up at me, his face drawn, tired. "We didn't want to ask you, Clara. We really didn't. But we've been struggling to keep up." I felt a pang of guilt, but it quickly faded. It wasn't my fault. They hadn't asked, they had expected. For years, I'd been their backup. And for years, they had ignored everything I did, as if it were just a given. I stood up, trying to remain calm. "How much do you need this time?" Lydia hesitated. We need a few thousand for repairs. For the water heater, you know." I knew what she was doing. The water heater repair was always the go-to excuse for her. She wasn't just asking for money for that. She needed it for the lifestyle she couldn't afford anymore. The clubs, the dinners, the things she hadn't let go of. I had seen the signs for months. "I'm not sure I can help you this time," I said, my voice quieter but firm. Lydia's expression hardened. "You're being unreasonable. Your father and I have always been there for you. Can't you just help us out a little more? We're family, Clara." Family? That word again? The one that always came with strings attached. "Family helps family," I said, repeating her words from all those years. I looked at her, trying not to show the anger boiling under my skin. But only when it's not one-sided. Lydia's face went white. She had expected me to say yes, like I always did, but not this time. "I'm sorry, but I can't," I said again, turning and walking toward the door. "I think it's time you figured things out on your own." I walked outside, the cool evening air stinging against my skin. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending to be the good daughter, the one who was always there, always ready to help. Evelyn's words rang in my head. "Let them think you have nothing." The truth was, I did have something. I had more than they could ever imagine, and I wasn't about to let them drag me down into their mess again. As I sat in my car, staring at the house behind me, I realized something. I had the power now. I didn't have to keep playing this role. But would I really be willing to walk away from them? Was I ready to cut the ties that had always bound me? Evelyn had made it clear. True strength is not in what you own, but when you reveal you own it. I wasn't sure I was ready to reveal everything, but soon I would have to. The question was whether my family would be ready to see it. A few days after that dinner, the air at my parents' house felt different. The house itself had always been a refuge, a place where I could retreat to when life got too overwhelming. But now, it felt like a trap. Every time I walked through the door, I was met with subtle reminders of their growing expectations. The requests for money had gotten louder, more frequent, and somehow more desperate. I had avoided them for as long as I could. But then, just when I thought I could breathe, my mother called me, her voice trembling with a sense of urgency. "Clara, she said, her voice breaking through the calm morning. You need to come to the house. It's it's bad. We we're in trouble. I didn't even need to ask what kind of trouble. It was the same kind of trouble they always found themselves in, the kind they thought would disappear if they could just convince me to help. I grabbed my jacket, the familiar feeling of dread settling over me. I knew this conversation was coming, and I knew what it would mean. My family's game of manipulation had reached its peak, and it was time for me to finally stand my ground. When I arrived at the house, I saw my mother standing in the doorway, her face pale. Behind her, I could hear the quiet murmurs of my father and Ethan, but I could tell they were avoiding eye contact. Clara, my mom whispered, her voice shaky. It's worse than we thought. I walked inside, trying to keep the frustration from overtaking me. The house, which once stood as a symbol of their so-called success, was now eerily quiet. The furniture was aging, the air stagnant. It looked as if it was being slowly drained of life. I could almost see it, how my parents' once lavish lifestyle was crumbling, the cracks widening with every failed investment and unspoken hope that I would fix everything. What's going on? I asked, crossing my arms. My father shuffled over to the kitchen table, where a stack of unopened bills lay in disarray. We can't pay the mortgage, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The bank's threatening to foreclose, and I don't know what to do, Clara. I stared at the stack of overdue bills, feeling the weight of my years of silence catching up to me. I had been their safety net for so long. Every time something went wrong, every time they had a crisis, I had been the one to bail them out. But this was different. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. And you think I'm just supposed to fix this again? I asked, my voice thick with frustration. Lydia, her face flushed with a mix of shame and anger, stepped forward. It's not that simple, Clara. We don't want to ask you, but we have no other choice. I could feel the old guilt creeping in, but I pushed it back. This was different. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me any longer. You've been asking me for help for years, I said, my voice growing sharper. Every time you need something, you come to me. Every time Ethan has another failed project, you expect me to fix it. I've been carrying you all, and what do I get in return? Nothing. Not a thank you, not even the slightest recognition. You think you can just keep using me? My mother's eyes filled with tears. Clara, please. We're family. We've always been there for you. Have you? I snapped. Have you really? Or have I just been your backup? Your safety net, the one you go to when everything falls apart. But I'm done. I could see the shock in their faces. Ethan, standing by the door, looked like he wanted to say something, but he remained silent. I could feel him there, in the background, always waiting for me to pick up the slack, but not this time. I'm sorry, but I can't help you anymore, I said, my voice steady. This is your problem to solve, not mine. Lydia's face crumpled. Clara, please. You don't understand. We've always been there for you. Your father and I, we've tried, but things just... No, I cut her off, my heart pounding. You haven't tried. You've taken and taken, and I've given and given. I'm done. I turned and walked toward the door, not even waiting for a response. The silence behind me was deafening, but I didn't care. I had finally said what needed to be said, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with the weight of what had just happened. I'd finally stood up to them. I had finally said no. As I walked into my apartment, I sank into the couch, feeling both drained and relieved. I knew I had made the right decision, but even though I felt a sense of freedom, a part of me ached. Could I really walk away from them? Could I really leave them to face the consequences of their choices without me? The answer wasn't clear, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to find out. The day of the bankruptcy hearing arrived far sooner than I anticipated, and as I walked into the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of anticipation and dread. This was the moment I had been both dreading and secretly craving, when I would finally reveal the truth. I wasn't just Clara Dawson, the quiet florist, anymore. Today I would stand in front of my family and the public, and I would be seen for what I truly was. The weight of Evelyn's inheritance now hung on my shoulders like a mantle, heavy and suffocating, but it was mine, all mine, and my family needed to see that. I stood at the back of the room, watching as the proceedings started. My parents were sitting at the front, looking haggard and defeated, their faces pale. Ethan sat next to them, a nervous grin plastered on his face, as though he still believed something could be salvaged. But I knew better. Today was going to change everything. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp glasses, called the room to order. The creditors were present, murmuring amongst themselves, some of them looking disappointed, others eager for the opportunity to get their money back. And then there was me, quiet, invisible, just as Evelyn had warned. But that was about to change. The attorney representing my family spoke first. He was trying to plead their case, showing how much hardship they were facing. I could see the desperation in his eyes as he outlined the mounting debts, the failed investments, and the looming foreclosure. The whole thing was a performance, one they had rehearsed for months, but I wasn't buying it. The moment I stood up, the entire room fell silent. The judge raised an eyebrow at me, and I felt a moment of intense clarity. "Your Honor," I began, my voice cutting through the silence, calm and steady. "I'm Clara Dawson, and I'm here as the primary creditor in this case." There was a ripple of surprise in the room, followed by a few whispers. My family's heads snapped up, their eyes wide with shock. They weren't expecting this. They didn't know. They couldn't know. I continued, my gaze steady, holding their eyes. "I am the sole heir to my late grandmother's estate. Evelyn Dawson's agricultural holdings, land, patents, operations across 3 states are now mine, and they are worth more than $30 million. The room exploded into murmurs. My family's faces were a mixture of disbelief, horror, and a hint of shame. My mother's mouth hung open, but no words came out. Ethan's jaw clenched as he tried to process what I had just said. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. They had always underestimated me, but today they would see me clearly. "I've held this information in confidence just as my grandmother requested," I went on, my voice growing stronger. "But I have decided it's time to stop hiding in the shadows. My family is here asking for money, but they've forgotten one crucial detail. I'm the one who controls the money now." I could see my father's face redden. He shot a look at Lydia, who seemed to shrink in her chair, but I wasn't done. "I'm here to present a debt restructuring proposal. It's not easy, but it's the only way forward," I said, turning to face the judge. "I will pay off their debts, but under 3 strict conditions." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go on." I looked back at my family, locking eyes with each of them in turn, letting them see my resolve. "First, Ethan will be required to work a low-paying agricultural job within the next 6 months. No more startups, no more drone projects. He will learn the value of hard work and start at the very bottom." The room shifted. Ethan's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to silence him. "Second," I continued, "Lydia and Robert will be required to live on a strict budget, one they will have to manage themselves. They will no longer live a life of excess, and they will start paying their own bills from this point forward. They will be responsible for their own future." Lydia let out a soft gasp, her eyes filling with panic. Robert just stared ahead, unable to meet my gaze. "And lastly," I said, my voice unwavering, "the family farm will be sold. My parents will sell it and use the proceeds to purchase a modest home. I'm willing to help them find something affordable, but the farm, the symbol of their old life, will be gone." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the judge seemed taken aback by the harshness of my terms. I could feel the weight of the decision on me, but it felt right. They needed to understand that I was no longer just the quiet daughter they could manipulate. "Are you prepared to enforce this?" the judge asked, her voice firm. "I am," I said without hesitation, "and I will not relent until these conditions are met." The judge nodded. "Very well. We will proceed with your proposal." As I sat back down, I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some full of admiration, others full of disbelief, but none of them mattered. Only one thing did now. I had the power, and my family was about to see how it felt to be on the other side. The days following the bankruptcy hearing felt surreal. I had walked into that courtroom, a quiet manager of a flower shop, and walked out as the head of an empire. But even more than that, I had reshaped my entire relationship with my family. They were no longer the ones who controlled the narrative, I was. I kept a low profile after the hearing, retreating into the flower shop and focusing on what I knew best. The delicate art of arranging flowers seemed like the only thing that made sense anymore. The petals were soft, predictable, and comforting, just like I needed them to be in those first few days. But deep down, I knew it couldn't last forever. The real world, the one I had inherited, was calling me. I spent the first month running things quietly, setting up the Evelyn Legacy Group, keeping it all hidden from my family. They had been reeling from the terms of the bankruptcy deal I had forced on them, but it was still hard to feel sorry for them. After all, this was their doing. I watched as Ethan, with his startup dreams shattered, reluctantly began working at a local farm, a far cry from the tech industry he so desperately wanted to be a part of. He didn't say much when I drove past him one afternoon, hunched over in the fields, but I could see the way he looked at me, his resentment still fresh. It was hard to watch him struggle, but it was necessary. He needed to learn that things didn't just fall into his lap. Lydia and Robert were living in a much smaller house now, one that suited their new, humbled reality. The grand farmhouse they'd always dreamed of was gone, sold off to pay their debts. The house they now inhabited was modest, small, but enough for them. It was strange to see them adjust to a life of frugality after all these years of excess. Lydia had traded her designer clothes for cheaper, simpler ones, and I noticed her looking at herself in the mirror with a kind of quiet regret, as if she were mourning a life she could never return to. It was the subtle signs of change that struck me the most. I saw Lydia watering the small garden in the backyard, something she had never done before, and Robert tinkering with the worn-down lawnmower, getting his hands dirty in a way he never had. It was almost normal, but the shift wasn't enough for me to feel anything other than relief. Then there was Ethan's new reality. No more extravagant dinners, no more expensive drones, just sweat and work. It was painful to watch him struggle with it, but it was the only way for him to grow. And despite everything, a part of me couldn't help but feel some small sense of vindication. It wasn't about revenge. It was about them finally understanding the consequences of their actions. But there was something else happening in the background, something I hadn't fully prepared for. One evening, as I was closing the shop, I received a message from an unexpected source. A text from Ethan. Ethan, we need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow? I stared at the phone for a moment, unsure how to respond. My first instinct was to ignore it, to keep my distance, to avoid getting dragged back into the mess I had just freed myself from. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the years of trying to help him, or maybe it was the fact that despite everything, he was still my brother. I agreed to meet him the next day. We decided on the park, neutral ground, a place where we wouldn't have to hide from the world. When I met him the next day, he was standing near the old swings, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets. He looked different, less confident, more defeated. The arrogance that used to color his every word was gone, replaced by something more genuine, something raw. Clara, he said, his voice tight, I don't know what to say. I nodded, not knowing what to say either. I wanted to ask him why he had done what he did, why he had treated me like I was the villain in our story. But I stopped myself. This wasn't about blame anymore. You don't have to say anything, I said, my voice quieter than I expected. But I think you owe yourself more than what you've been doing. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his shoes. I get it. I do. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. The sincerity in his words caught me off guard. I had expected him to lash out, to blame me again, but instead he was admitting his failures. It wasn't much, but it was something. You've got to start somewhere, I said, my heart softening just a little. You can't keep running from your mistakes. You have to own them and work, real work. He nodded, looking like he had 1,000 things he wanted to say, but couldn't quite get the words out. I'm working at the farm now, he finally said, looking up at me. It's not what I thought I'd be doing, but it's something. And I don't want your money anymore. I'm going to figure it out on my own. I nodded, feeling the tension between us ease just slightly. Good. That's good, Ethan. There was a long silence. Then he hesitantly added, You're really in charge now, huh? I didn't want to boast, but the truth was undeniable. Yeah, I am. After our conversation, things shifted in a way I hadn't expected. Ethan began to change. Slowly, painfully, but he was changing. And though I didn't expect him to become a perfect person overnight, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. I had never wanted him to fail, but I needed him to understand that failure was a part of life, a part of growing up. As for me, the weight of Evelyn's empire didn't feel quite as suffocating anymore. I was finding my balance between the old me, the florist, and the new me, the one who had the power to shape her own future. The flower shop wasn't going anywhere. It was still my refuge, my place of peace. But I also had the tools now to build something bigger, to take control not just of my life, but of my family's future. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about transformation, about letting go of the past. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what was to come. 5 years had passed since the day I stood in that courtroom, revealing the truth about Evelyn's legacy to the family. In those years, I had transformed in ways I hadn't expected. The power that had once felt so heavy in my hands now felt like part of who I was, something that anchored me, rather than weighed me down. My family had adjusted, whether they liked it or not, and I had found peace in the process. The flower shop, Bloom and Petal, was thriving more than ever. It had always been my anchor, my safe space, but now it was something more. It was a symbol of my success, my stability, my choice to live life on my own terms. But there was more to my story now. It wasn't just about flowers anymore. It wasn't just about the inheritance either. I had a purpose beyond the quiet, behind-the-scenes world I had spent my life in. I had built something real and lasting. I stood behind the counter at Bloom and Petal, arranging a bouquet of lilies when the bell over the door chimed. I looked up to see a teenager, probably around 17 or 18, standing in the doorway, looking a bit nervous but hopeful. He was holding a small notebook, the edges worn and frayed. "Can I help you?" I asked, wiping my hands on the apron. He looked up at me, his face a mix of uncertainty and determination. "Yeah, I'm looking for some advice. I'm trying to start my own business, something to do with landscaping. But I don't know where to begin." I smiled. It was a rare thing for someone to walk in here for advice rather than just a bouquet. But I recognized something in his eyes. The same determination I had felt when I started Bloom and Petal. The same hunger to prove something. I set the bouquet down gently and walked over to him. "I think I can help you with that. Starting a business is never easy, but it's worth it. You've got to start small, focus on what you do best, and build from there. Have you already thought about your market?" He nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I've been doing landscaping work for a while, just for some friends. But I want to turn it into something more, something that lasts." "That's a great start," I said, leaning against the counter. "But remember, a business is about more than just what you can do. It's about the connections you make, the people you trust, and the vision you have for your future. You have to build a reputation first. Word of mouth is everything." He pulled out his notebook and scribbled something down. "I've been saving up some money to get started, but I don't really know how to get clients, or how to keep track of everything, really." "Tracking everything is key," I said, my mind briefly drifting back to when I first started Bloom and Petal. I had made plenty of mistakes, but each one had been a learning experience. Start simple. Use something like spreadsheets or an app to track clients, payments, and jobs. You don't need a fancy system right away, just something that works for you. He smiled, looking a little more confident. "Thanks. I'll give it a try." Before he could leave, I asked, "What's your name?" "Jake," he replied, holding out a hand. "Jake Carter." "Nice to meet you, Jake. If you need anything, don't hesitate to come by. Starting a business is tough, but you've got to have someone who can point you in the right direction." Jake gave me a grateful nod before walking out the door, his notebook tucked securely under his arm. I watched him go, feeling a sense of pride. I wasn't just running a flower shop anymore. I was giving back. I was helping people like me, people who had the ambition but didn't know where to start. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me back from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was a reminder for my upcoming speaking engagement at Cornell's Agricultural Business School. I had agreed to deliver a keynote speech on resilience and entrepreneurship. It had been 5 years since Evelyn's passing, and now I was being asked to speak about my journey. It felt like everything had come full circle. I had become something more than I ever imagined, something more than just the daughter of a humble woman with a hidden fortune. I was now a quiet powerhouse, someone who had taken the lessons from my past and turned them into something that was both meaningful and lasting. The event was a week later, and when I stepped up to the podium at Cornell's Agricultural Business School, the sea of students and professors looking back at me felt surreal. I had never imagined that this would be my life. But here I was, not just a manager of a flower shop, but someone who had built a legacy. Someone who had learned the hard way, but had grown stronger because of it. I cleared my throat, adjusted the microphone, and began. 5 years ago, I found out I was the sole heir to an agricultural empire, $30 million, more than I could ever imagine. But it wasn't the money that changed me. It was the responsibility that came with it. The legacy wasn't just about what I had inherited. It was about what I had to do with it. I paused, looking out at the audience, their eyes filled with anticipation. True strength, I continued, remembering Evelyn's words, is not in what you own. It's in when you reveal you own it. But it's more than just owning something, it's about knowing when to share it, when to stand up, and when to make sure the next generation has a chance to stand on their own. After my speech, I stood in the lobby, shaking hands with students and faculty, answering questions, and feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. I was no longer hiding in the shadows. I was helping others, empowering them to find their own path, just as Evelyn had empowered me, even from beyond the grave. Later that evening, I took a moment to myself, sitting quietly in my hotel room, reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about my family, how they had changed, how they had learned to survive without my help, how Ethan was now working hard at the farm, how Lydia and Robert were slowly adapting to their new, simpler life. And for the first time, I felt peace. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to be vindicated. What I had was enough. I had built something meaningful. I had built a legacy. Epilogue. As I walked back into Bloom and Petal, the familiar scent of fresh flowers surrounded me. My life had changed in ways I never expected, but I had learned to embrace it. I wasn't just Clara Dawson anymore, the quiet florist who everyone underestimated. I was something more, something stronger. I looked at the picture of Evelyn hanging on the wall above the counter, her gentle smile looking back at me. She had always known the truth, and now I did too. My family was rebuilding, and so was I. Together, we were learning what it meant to live with dignity, resilience, and strength. And the best part, it was only just beginning.